Well, welcome to CMMC Unacknowledged, where we answer the unanswered questions that were asked during the monthly CMMC-AB Townhall meetings. My name is Todd Stanton. I'm the Regional Sales Manager for all things CMMC at Etactics. As always, I'm joined by Ty Wittenberg. Ty is the Senior Information Assurance Manager at Rain Associates. Welcome, Ty.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Good to see you this morning.
Fantastic.
So, continuing on our conversation about CUI, is the DFARS clause 252.204-7012 only invoked when CUI is actually present?
So that really has to do not just with CUI, but with incident response, right? When you believe that based on safeguardings that there is a chain of sharing that an incident has happened. So I would say that, federal contract information, which is not necessarily top secret or secret, but if it is exposed, you need to be able to notify as well too. So that ruling is in regards to notifying your prime and notifying your C3 that there has been an incident.
Okay.
An incident of, and I say incident because incident, compromise, and breach are two different things. Breach is a legal term which clearly states that there's been an exfiltration of information. You have 72 hours in which to notify it to your prime and to the defense sources in order to report the incident and also do your investigation. So it's an incident of compromise until you can actually confirm whether through that partnership with them and forensic resources that actual information has been exfiltrated out of your environment.
Okay, so that exists regardless of whether CUI is present or not?
So if it is listed on your documentation, on your contract, any information that was shared with you from your prime or from the DoD directly, and they have this rule 252.204.712 stamped on there, that means that information falls, any information that they shared with you in the documentation falls under your responsibility to report if there's an incident.
Okay. And so, part of that description on the DFARS clause says that all covered defense information provided to the contractor by the government will be marked or otherwise identified in the contract, task order, or delivery order, right? Sound familiar? But
Correct.
What happens down the stream when that information isn't marked, right? But that clause still exists. So how would you advise a client who has that clause, but they haven't been specified by their higher tier contractor what information that they're getting or maybe producing would be considered covered defense information?
So covered defense, CUI, FCI, that's a great question, right? If your upstream isn't marking it, but you know that you're doing business that's potentially tied to a defense contract, my understanding of the rule, and I'm not an attorney, so please forgive me and don't take this as legal advice. But my understanding of the rule is you are responsible then once it's in your hands to ask the right questions and treat it accordingly if you believe it's part of controlled and classified information. And so I may have said this on many of our conversations before in the past, but I love my dad, but he used to say this thing when I was a teenager that drove me nuts, which was ignorance of the law is no excuse. And as a teenager, I wanted to strangle him, but now I understand why he said that to me. You can't plead ignorance in these particular cases. So do your due diligence if you're a subcontractor to a prime, no matter how far down the line you are, and ask some clarifying questions.
And do you direct those questions to the prime or who's providing that information, or do you try to go to the contracting officer from DoD that's providing that contract to the prime?
You may not have a line of sight to that contract officer from the DoD, so follow your upline, right? Whoever, in essence, whoever your client is, reach out to them and ask those clarifying questions with their procurement and contracting officer. And if that procurement and contracting officer doesn't know, then they should be reaching up to theirs to get some clarifying answers for you, just so that we're safeguarding in essence, we're safeguarding the nation's proprietary information for our defenses.
Do you think that there is an over prescription of that DFARS 7012 clause in contracts that really don't have CUI? And especially if it's not marked, right? But they're trying to cover their bases, and hey, we got it with the 7012 clause, so we're going to pass it down to this machine shop. And even though I can't tell them specifically what part of the information I'm giving them is CUI, I've got to cover my bases because I know it's in my contract, so I'm going to pass it down. Do you feel like that's a legitimate concern and a problem?
That is a legitimate concern. I've had several clients that have shared with me that it feels like the procurement office from their customer, or whether that be a prime or the second tier of a subcontractor from a prime, that they feel like it's just a boilerplate stamp, right? And that at the end of the day, some of the stuff that they're buying from them is commercial off-the-shelf items, something that no different that you or I, Todd, could go to Lowe's or Home Depot or to a specialty hardware shop and get that particular rubber gasket or screw or whatever. And so I think there needs to be better clarity and better understanding from procurement offices and stuff like that, not to just boilerplate, because when you do that, you create undue burden on the defense industrial base, those subcontractors that potentially, because it's in the language on that documentation, now have to comply with that information. Now, once again, I'm not an attorney, and so it would, I guess that could be a question of debate, but who wants to sit up there and spend additional money to debate that this is commercial off the shelf when it's been stamped that it's this, and because of that, I have to implement. Once again, I that's a business decision, cost benefit analysis, or your risk quantification, but it creates undue burden. To answer that question.
Is there a process if they feel it is the same SKU that they're selling to Best Buy that they're providing to Lockheed Martin? Is there a process by which they can go through and adjudicate that this is a commercial off-the-shelf product and I'm not really beholden to any type of information safeguarding because it's not CUI?
So that particular part, I'm not an expert with when it comes to this particular space. With GSA, it's much easier to do that because a lot of that, shopping that happens through the GSA is done, via, and that's the Government Services Administration, by the way, is a lot lighter because that's, people will come and buy it with a credit card on a purchase order, whatever that may be. And so there might be some markings on there, but clearly the buyer is understanding that it's commercial off the shelf. The reality is you could take a partner, right? There's resources that you have in your environments, whether it be RPs, RPOs, your procurement technical centers, in your states. But more importantly, you could reach out to contacts in the DoD procurement and get clarification around if the marking's on there, but it's commercial off the shelf. But once again, now we're talking about time and resources, right? So that's where I think a lot of this funnels into. In previous conversations that you and I have had, is your DIB, is your organization seeking certification or your defense industrial contractor going to take all those additional steps versus focusing on what makes them money? That's a tough question to answer.
And even if it was a commercial off-the-shelf product, I think the thing to remember is even if you make one modification to that commercial off-the-shelf product to use it for a government contract, for DoD. That one
Right.
modification means the world, right? Because now it's not a commercial off the shelf.
That is correct. So any modification to it, to your point, you have now, if you've taken apart and then modified it for a specific thing, that is truly controlled unclassified information. If you design the modifications internally because you have the computer aided design skill sets and the engineers to do that, and you go through the specs or you improve the specs for your client or the next tier up in the contractor space, then you've created controlled unclassified information, and now you should treat it as such. That is not a part then that I could just go get from Lowe's. That is specific to whatever that warfighter product you're developing or vehicle, whatever that may be.
And so last time we talked a little bit about, the creation of CUI, and I want to go back to the definition for covered defense information. So I'll read you the textbook definition here. Unclassified controlled technical information or other information as described in the CUI registry that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls pursuant to and consistent with law, regulations, and government-wide policies, and so here's where there's two potential avenues for identifying what is covered defense information. Marked or otherwise identified in the contract. That's pretty clear, right? But
that's really clear.
The problem is if it's not marked, so then you go on to two, collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of performance of the contractor. So those adjectives, collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, stored. I mean, you start to think of information that would be used in the course of a contract. That could almost be anything, right? It's a very broad definition.
It is broad strokes, right? So I think it's trying to amass and cover a lot of different pathways in which this new documentation is being created, being disseminated, being developed or proliferated. And so you've just like you have to be very protective around what you share and send around emails and stuff like that. If you're going back and forth, because obviously if you're making modifications or improvements for the specs, because maybe through a QC process, quality control process, you identify the diagrams that they sent through the tests, it failed 90% of the time. And so you need to modify this particular one thing. You have enhanced that information. And so to some degree, it changes the scope of design, right?
Right.
And so you have to have partnership with the engineers that said, this is why you put that particular grommet, or this is why this particular piece of steel needed to be milled to this specific specs. And engineers have to talk about it. I don't want to be Debbie Downer, right? But think about NASA and the space shuttle and when we were kids, and all of the issues with the grommets that they used on the fueling lines based off of the temperatures of, when you make those types of modifications because of QC, other engineers have to be involved. So that is controlled and classified information. And to be honest with you, at that particular point, because of the back and forth, all those adverbs and adjectives that you talked about, transmission, creation, all that other stuff, there's a lot of moving parts going on around there that now you clearly have to be vigilant in safeguarding that information from other nation states that might want to steal our defense, our national security, intellectual property.
And so I kind of look at it as almost a pyramid where you have covered defense information, which covers CUI and CTI, which is a subset of CUI, right? And CTI, control technical information, you're talking about NASA, military or space applications that's subject to controls on access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, display, release, disclosure, or dissemination. That's the stuff that I think is really the most valuable information, right? Is that controlled technical information?
Yeah, for sure.
And it was interesting in reading about the history of all the rulemaking that's happened since the executive order under Obama. It sounded like that's where DoD really first started implementing their controls, was around controlled technical information. And then it wasn't until the OPM hack and all the release of personal identifiable information from anyone who's gone through a background check within the government. That's when they realized that all these other categories of CUI are worth protecting as well, and that's when they came up with the term covered defense information to really broaden the scope of the security requirements to protect just not only control technical information, but other categories of CUI that DoD holds as well.
Definitely. I mean, every president has had some impact on our defense industrial base and how we feel that we're safeguarding that. So Obama with the proliferation and greater use of technology, but also the proliferation of nation states utilizing cyber for weaponization and for, in essence, industrial espionage has improved it. And look, President Trump took us through the next phase of it as well, too, with CMMC, with helping to create the CMMC-AB, right? And now you've got President Biden, who's talking about moving us even further, not necessarily around CMMC-AB and raising the security awareness in the defense industrial base in the government, but now taking us a step further that just because you've put all these security measures in place in your environment, and we utilize our usual authentication processes, that now it doesn't matter. A threat actor can mimic that, can copy it, can infiltrate. Spoof is what we like to use in our world, right? And so now zero trust is the next movement, right? While all of these other things are going on that you're talking about, because when you think about what Obama did, in 2012. The DoD made some modifications to the DoD instructions on controlled unclassified information. And that was 5200.48, right? And then it was revisited again this year in March, or not this year in March, but in 2020 in March, when we were going through this whole journey as well, too, with CUI.
And it sounds like there's still a journey to be had in terms of the government wrapping their hands around how to consolidate. And the undertaking. You think about what the NARA and what they're trying to do with the CUI program. It's not just DoD. Like DoD is one of 30 or so agencies that hold CUI, and CMMC is focused on obviously DoD today. But this FAR CUI rule that comes out will impact all of those agencies, correct?
For sure. There was early scuttle conversations that the GSA was going to take a look at adopting that. Other organizations that do business with the executive branch were going to look at the CMMC journey. Those aren't official, right? But prior to CMMC, there's FedRAMP as well, too, around cloud providers and stuff like that as well. So there is a ton of moving parts going around that hopefully at some particular point, I think the defense industrial base, our organization seeking certification, whether those be manufacturers, educational institutions, things like that, get some unified clarity in there. Otherwise, it's like swimming in a rip current and then swimming on calm shores and then, swimming upstream. It's a battle for especially the small businesses that might be impacted in this space to really wrap their arms around it if they're trying to go at it by themselves.
Absolutely. Well, that's why they have people like you to come in and help them, right?
Well, yeah, before they even created the CMMC accreditation body and the RP process, if you have folks out there, like you, like myself, like the procurement, technical centers and things like that in different states, there's a ton of resources, but getting people to jump on that cyber bandwagon has always been a little bit of a tough journey for us. And so I think what really comes out of my experiences in doing this is raising cultural awareness, whether that be not only just in the digital space, but also in the analog with paper, right? Because you and I, we always focus our conversations on technical, but if you look at that rule as well, too, it talks about transmission, sending that information via regular mail, UPS or FedEx, all that other stuff. Those are analog processes, but they're all threat vectors and exposure points.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave it there for this topic. Thank you again for your time this morning, Ty. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me.